the foreign review for AP Macroeconomics. The first thing with AP Macroeconomics in the foreign section is that trade is always good. We want trade. It leads to increased specialization, increased productivity, and increased long-run economic growth. And there are two ways to measure trade: absolute and comparative advantage. With both of these, before you start, you need to ask one important question. Is it an input or is it an output problem? An output problem is changing quantity, fixed resources. An input problem is changing resources, and by that I mean changing time, changing acres of land, or changing labor units, and fixed quantity. So in this example, it's me producing one pencil an hour or two erasers an hour. The hour, the resource is fixed. What is changing is the quantity, so this is an output problem. Now the first thing we want to do with this is calculate absolute advantage, which is just who's better at the production of pencils and erasers. And in both scenarios, Mrs. Moore is better because she can make more in an hour than I can. And if trade wasn't good and we based it on absolute advantage, she wouldn't trade with me. But we do not base trade on absolute advantage. We base it on comparative advantage. Instead of measuring just who's better, we look at who gives up less to make pencils and who gives up less to make erasers, and that determines trade. So to measure these opportunity costs, remember in an output problem, to calculate an opportunity cost, we divide the inside by the outside to get this number. So for me to produce one pencil, I give up two erasers, and then I just flip it around. For me to produce one eraser, I give up half of a pencil. Same thing for Mrs. Moore. Outside over inside. For Mrs. Moore to produce one pencil, she gives up 4/3 of an eraser, and for her to produce one eraser, she gives up 3/4 of a pencil. And then all you have to do is look in the row of pencils and the row of erasers and say who gives up less to make a pencil and who gives up less to make an eraser. So Mrs. Moore would have the comparative advantage in pencils, and I would have the comparative advantage in erasers. So that's how we measure who should sell a good, export a good, and import in the other good they do not have the comparative advantage in. So for me, since I have the comparative advantage in erasers, I will specialize and produce erasers, I will sell them, and I will buy pencils from Mrs. Moore. The final thing we have to do with a comparative advantage problem is set up the terms of trade. The terms of trade look at what are the ratios that I would still trade with Mrs. Moore for pencils and erasers, and she would still trade for me. So to set up for pencils, my terms of trade would be between the two opportunity costs. So between 4/3 and 2. So I would still be willing to trade with Mrs. Moore as long as the price is less than 2. Because this number right here, because I am the importer, this is from the buyer's perspective. So this is the max price I, the buyer, the importer, am willing to pay for a pencil. This, the 4/3, is Mrs. Moore's perspective because she is the seller of pencils. So she wants to sell it for as high of a price as possible. So she will only accept a price at or higher than 4/3, because if the price is lower than 4/3, then the cost of producing the pencil will be greater than the selling price, and she'll lose money and she has no incentive to trade. So let's say on an example that now the terms of trade for one pencil is 3 erasers. We know this does not fit into the terms of trade, and the reason why is because although Mrs. Moore would be more than willing to sell the pencils for 3 because she'd make a ton of profit, I, the buyer, would not be willing to pay that price because I could just produce it cheaper myself. So although she would do the trade, I would not. Then the terms of trade for erasers are between the two opportunity costs for erasers, or between 1/2 and 3/4. Now again, we're looking at it from the perspective of the buyer and the seller. And so in this case, I am the seller. This is the minimum price I'm willing to sell it for. Mrs. Moore is the buyer. This is the maximum price she's willing to pay. So let's say in this example now, one eraser is exchanged for 1/4 pencil. Now again, it does not fit into the terms of trade. So I would be totally willing, as the buyer, to pay that price because it is much cheaper than producing it myself. But the reason why it's unacceptable is Mrs. Moore, the seller, would not be willing to sell it for that low of a price because she'd lose money because the cost of producing it is higher than the selling price. And that is how we calculate an output problem. But we also need to calculate an input problem. So you set up the chart the same exact way, except now it's going to be changing resources instead of changing output. So I'm going to do the same example with pencils and erasers, but it's going to be in 1 hour or in 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. And one of the biggest tips I can say is that if it's an input problem, put the resource on there, because that helps remind you that it's an input problem. Otherwise, you might mix up what type of problem it is. So it's changing time, changing resources, fixed output. That's what makes it an input problem. And the first thing we notice on this input problem is absolute advantage is opposite. Now, I have the absolute advantage in pencils because I can make only takes an hour to make a pencil versus more, which takes 3 hours, and I have the absolute advantage in erasers. So absolute advantage in an input problem is the lower number because they use the least amount of resources. But again, that doesn't determine trade. We still use comparative advantage. And the trick with an input problem is if you switch your division from what you did last time, you'll end up being able to compare it the exact same way you looked at the output problem. What I mean by this, in an output problem, you divided the outside by the inside to get the opportunity cost. Now you're going to divide the inside by the outside. So input problem, inside first. So for me, now to make one pencil, inside over outside, I give up the opportunity to make half of an eraser. Then just flip it. For one eraser, I give up the opportunity to make 2 pencils. For Mrs. Moore to make one pencil, inside over outside, she gives up the opportunity to make 3/4 of an eraser. And for her to make one eraser, she gives up the opportunity to make 4/3 of a pencil. But then from there on out, you'd analyze this the exact, to the T, same way you did an output problem. So the two differences, absolute advantage in an input problem is the lowest number, and an output problem is the highest number. And in an output problem, you divide the outside by the inside to get the opportunity cost. In an input problem, you divide the inside by the outside to get the opportunity cost. But then from there, same exact thing. So again, now I have the comparative advantage in pencils, and Mrs. Moore has the comparative advantage in erasers, so I will sell pencils and buy erasers. She will sell erasers and buy pencils. And you still set up the terms of trade the exact same way. So for pencils now, the terms of trade are between 1/2, and you notice it's less than or equal to. It can be equal to the opportunity cost, and 3/4, because I am the seller and this is the minimum price I'm willing to sell it for. Mrs. Moore is the buyer. This is the maximum price she's willing to pay. And for erasers, we will still trade as long as it's between 4/3 and 2, because this is the max price I am willing to pay as the importer. This is the minimum price Mrs. Moore is willing to sell it for. And that's how we do trade in terms of comparative and absolute advantage. Now, before we move on to the currency market, I wanted to talk about the balance of payments because this tends to mix us up. In the balance of payments, we're looking at the current and capital account. The current account is just immediate transactions between countries, because again, we're in the foreign market, so it's looking at how much money we are spending in other countries or how much money other countries are spending in America. So the current account are immediate transactions between us and other countries. Capital accounts are new investments in another country or another country directly investing in us. So new investments. Examples of capital account. If we directly invest in China, if we buy stocks, bonds, and loans from Germany, if we directly invest in England, that is all capital account because those are new investments in that other country. Those are also liabilities. A liability is when it's taking the money from your country and putting it into the other country's economy. Current account, immediate transaction, consists of exports and imports. So if we export goods to China, tourism, so if Mexicans come and tour America, foreign aid, if Australia sends foreign aid to America, or interest and dividends on existing investments. Because remember, again, only new investments count under capital. So if it's payment on an existing investment, it counts under current. And all of those examples, when we are exporting, or other countries' citizens are touring America, or other countries are sending aid to America, not only are all those examples of current account, those are also good examples of assets for our account balance, because that's all bringing money into the United States from another country. And once you know that, you have the basics of the balance of payments. One thing to note is that if a country has more liabilities than it has assets, it will create an account deficit. If an account has more assets than it has liabilities, that will create an account surplus. And a lot of times it asks questions like, if GDP goes up, and then the next question it asks, what will happen to the current account balance? Well, if GDP goes up, consumers have more income to spend, which means they'll spend more money in the foreign market, will import more goods or tour other countries with the increase in income. So we are spending more money in another country. That's more liabilities for the United States because it's taking our money and putting it in another country, which means we would have an account deficit. Now from there, we can now measure the currency graphs. So the currency graphs, they could ask you to draw the supply and demand of two countries or just one, which is why I always draw both, because you never know which one they're going to ask you to draw. So we're going to look at a situation between the United States and the dollar graph for the United States. So this is how you label the dollar graph for the United States, and we're going to compare it to Mexico, the Mexican peso. So it'd be how many Mexican pesos does it take for $1? So the dollar is always in the denominator, it's the subject of the graph. Then we have the demand for the dollar. The demand for the dollar moves if other countries are spending money in America, or if there's an increase in assets, the demand for the dollar increases. And we have the supply of the dollar. The supply of the dollar moves if we are spending more money in another country, or an increase in supply is an increase in liabilities. And then I'm going to compare it to the Mexican peso. So I'm also going to draw the Mexican peso graph. So quantity of the Mexican peso, now the dollar's on top and the Mexican peso is the subject. Demand for the Mexican peso, supply of the Mexican peso, and we're going to be looking at their equilibriums and using that to measure if a currency appreciates or depreciates. Because if equilibrium price goes up, a currency appreciates. If equilibrium price goes down, a currency depreciates. So let's say that inflation within the United States has increased. Inflation within the United States has increased. We're going to think about this in terms of, if inflation within the United States has increased, what's this going to do with foreign spending inside of America? Other countries are not going to want to spend money in America. So because of this, Mexico's like, why would I spend money in America when the prices of their goods are higher? Do not ever directly relate inflation to the value, appreciate or depreciate. There is an indirect relationship, but not a direct relationship. So we're going to keep that separate. All inflation in America means is that if Mexico wants to buy American goods, they now look more expensive. So Mexico is not going to spend money in America. And if there's less of the Mexican peso out there in the world because they are not spending money in America, the supply will decrease, and that will drive the value of the Mexican peso up. We call this appreciates when we're dealing with currency. If they are not spending money in America, the demand for the dollar would fall. And it always follows this pattern. Supply on one graph moves, demand on the other graph move, and they always move in the same direction. So a decrease and a decrease. So the demand for the dollar will decrease because they are not spending money in America, which now, because this goes down, that means the value of our currency will depreciate. And the final thing we look at with this is what this does to exports over time, because this is all a progression. The increase in investment leads to this, which leads to this, which leads to a change in exports. So if the value of a currency appreciates, Mexico's goods now look more expensive to other countries because the value has increased. So over time, because of this, Exports in Mexico will go down because their currency now looks more expensive to people who think, do I want to tour in Mexico? Why? Their currency is more expensive. Or do I want to buy Mexican products? Why? Their currency is more expensive. Or in America, if our currency looks cheaper to other countries, exports over time will go up because they look more attractive to those countries. So this is the relationship between currency and exports. Now, I'm going to do one more example because it leads to a really important concept with these graphs, interest rates. So in this unit, we are in the foreign market, and I've told you guys many times in GDP, in the domestic market, when we've looked at interest rates and investing, we've looked at it from the perspective of the borrower. But in the foreign market, in capital account, I'm asking the question of, do I want to invest in another country in terms of loaning the other country money? So the capital market in the foreign exchange market is from the perspective of the lender. So should I invest in Europe depends on if I'm going to make more profit from investing in Europe. And the way I make more profit as the lender is by having high interest rates. So in GDP, high interest rates discouraged investment because it was from the perspective of the borrower. Should we buy a house? Should we increase inventory? We have to borrow money to do so. If interest rates are high, I'm not going to want to borrow money. So GDP is from the perspective of the borrower. The foreign market is from the perspective of the lender. So when I'm asking the question, do I want to invest in another country? Well, if that other country has higher interest rates, then yes, I do, because I can make more profit from that investment. So let's say now, instead of high inflation, the United States has higher interest rates than Mexico. So same two graphs, but a very different change because higher interest rates are a good thing in the foreign market. So I still have the dollar graph and the Mexican peso graph. Still labeling everything correctly. If you don't know the symbol for a currency, you don't have to memorize all of those. You can just write out the American currency or the Mexican peso. You don't have to know that it's the Mexican peso is the M with the dollar sign. Okay, so now I have both of my graphs correctly labeled, and now Mexico, because they hear America has higher interest rates than they do, they are going to be encouraged to come to America and invest in America. So because of this, Mexico is now spending more money in America because they are investing in America. This would also mean that this is a liability for Mexico and they would have an account deficit. This would drive down the value or depreciate the value of the Mexican peso, which means over time it would drive exports up. And in America, if they are spending money here, if they are investing in America, the demand for the dollar will increase. And if the demand for the dollar goes up, the value of the dollar appreciates, which although this is a good thing in the short run, more investment in America, it's an asset, it creates an account surplus. In the long run, because that will appreciate our currency, exports over time will go down. So that shows the important difference between inflation and high interest rates. High inflation discourages spending in a foreign country. Higher interest rates encourages investment in another country. So very important distinction to make. And we just have one more thing to cover in this graph, and it's crowding out of net foreign investment. And there are three graphs to go with this, and as I'm drawing them, I'm going to set up what crowding out of net foreign investment is. So crowding out of net foreign investment is a criticism of expansionary fiscal policy, just like crowding out of gross private investment was. They're both criticisms of expansionary fiscal policy, and they're both criticisms specifically of when the government runs a budget deficit because they're spending more and collecting less in taxes, it will negatively impact interest rates. So we are going to again relate this to the loanable funds graph just like we did in crowding out of gross private investment. But the graph we're comparing it to is different. This is the graph of net foreign investment. Net foreign investment looks at how much Americans are investing in other countries. Are we taking our investments to other countries, or are we keeping our investments inside of America? And whatever happens here determines how much money we're spending in other countries. So that's going to impact the value of the dollar. So I have the dollar graph here, and it's going to look a little different because the supply of the dollar is going to be vertical. And that's because we're only talking about the capital market, supply of the dollar in terms of investment, not the current market. So that's why it looks different. On the AP exam, you're going to want to normally just draw it as an upward sloping line, not vertical. It doesn't mean anything like monetary policy does with a vertical line or the long run lines do. It's just because it's just looking at the capital market and not the current market. We still have the demand for the dollar, and now we're just going to look at, instead of the value of the dollar compared to the peso, we're looking at the value of the dollar compared to all of the currencies in the world, and we look at that as real exchange rate. So it's a little bit different, but it still works the same way. Appreciate, depreciate, exports go up or down based on the change in that. So crowding out of net foreign investment, as I said, is because of a government budget deficit created from expansionary fiscal policy. Now with this, if we have a budget deficit, the government will either have to borrow more to fund the deficit or save less. Either line can move to show this. If it's a saving, move supply, borrowing, move demand. We're going to do savings this time. So in a deficit, they save less, so supply of loanable funds will decrease, which we notice drives real interest rates up. And that's significant and a little bit different from crowding out of gross private investment, because before, when crowding out of gross private investment occurred, real interest rates drove down the IG of GDP. Now, though, we're looking at how that affects how much Americans are investing in other countries. If real interest rates in the United States are higher than other countries, we're not going to want to invest in other countries. We're going to want to invest in us. We're going to be the lender for America. We're going to invest in stocks and bonds and all of this stuff in America and not invest in other countries, which is why the increase in real interest rates decreases net foreign investment, because we're keeping our investment here where the interest rate is higher and not spending money in another country. And if we are not spending money in another country, the supply of the dollar is going to decrease because there's less of the dollar out there in the world. And if the supply of the dollar decreases, that drives up the value of the dollar, also known as it appreciates it, which means that over time, exports will go down. Which that was a really long explanation. But remember, this is a criticism of expansionary fiscal policy. We're fighting a recession, and the XN component of GDP is now decreasing. The opposite intended effect. When we're trying to boost GDP, the XN is going down. So crowding out of gross private investment hurts the IG of GDP. Crowding out of net foreign investment hurts the XN of GDP. But they're both criticisms of the government fighting a recession, which ends up creating a deficit and raising real interest rates. And that is the end of the foreign review in macroeconomics.